All right, everybody, we are officially live. I'm so excited to dive into another pre-symposium panel as we talk about how to maximize our team's potential. This is a lead up, a ramp up as we lead into our executive symposium next week. I can't believe it's already here next week, October 17th in Houston, Texas, where we'll get together from 5 to 8 p.m. to discuss how to maximize our team's potential, what we can do as leaders to best leverage our teams, be the best leaders we can be for our teams, and ultimately achieve the outcomes that we're all striving to achieve as a business and as an organization. So in these pre-symposium panels, what we do is we bring attendees who are coming to the executive symposium next week to discuss their thoughts on the executive symposium. So if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet these three great leaders, come to the executive symposium next week. I'll put the link in the comments on this video for how to RSVP. But Erica, Shubhra, Robert, I'm so glad to have you here. Do you all mind introducing yourselves? Erica, do you mind going first?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me again, Garrett. My name's Erica Gill. I am the Chief People Officer at Good Ranchers. We're a meat subscription company in Houston, Texas.
Very cool. Shubhra, how about you?
Hey, thank you, Garrett, for having me. My name is Shubhra Gupta, and I am the Business Development and Client Success Director for a global technology organization called Aspire Systems. We are based out of Chicago and multiple locations in the US, but I just moved to Houston, so that's exciting. And I have been in the industry for over 15 years, leading with various leading technology services companies like Oracle, Microsoft, Salesforce, and wearing different hats and collaborating with customers globally, internal teams. So this topic is really close to my heart because being a liaison between different teams, which is direct and indirect, really brings this question and topic all the time about how to maximize your team's potential. You have to take care of multiple things and build up different strategies to, have their career defined. And I appreciate you bringing up this topic and really looking forward to the discussion.
Very cool. And Robert, how about you?
Sure. My name is Robert Cocheu, 20 plus years experience, talent development industry. Currently, I'm the training manager at CVR Energy. We're located here in Sugar Land, Texas, but we are a company that a small refiner of renewable fuels, petroleum refining, and nitrogen fertilizer. Our manufacturing facilities are in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Illinois. And so glad to be here. And I'm kind of like Shubhra. This is one of those things that this is one of those topics rather that I've always been very, very passionate about is team building and how do you get the effectiveness out of your team and how do you move your team forward as one to the point that I radically developed training about it like every place I've ever been. So it's one of those things I just feel very strongly about. So glad to be here. Thank you, Garrett.
Of course, of course. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality. And when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways we build communities by hosting these executive symposiums where we bring leaders together to discuss different vulnerabilities, challenges, issues, just wins that they've had with their team to share success stories, share learning lessons, and ultimately allow us as leaders to learn from each other and be the best we can for our team. So let's dive in how to maximize our team's potential. So knowing Erica, knowing Shubhra, knowing Robert, and your focus on talent development, your focus on just improving and augmenting talent and helping people be the best they can be in the roles, I recognize that part of maximizing our team's potential is being able to repurpose people when business needs change. Ultimately, what you were hired for maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, or maybe even more recently than that, could be very different from what the needs of the business are now. Business needs change, the economy changed, businesses make pivots, businesses run experiments, realize maybe some of those experiments weren't working, but they've got a new experiment they want to run. What I'd be curious to know is what have you found to be effective for getting that buy-in to make adjustments to how people do their work? Because change is hard. No one likes to change. Something I so often hear from people, especially when they're being asked to change, is this was not part of my job description when I first signed on here. And it's like, well, You could either like have a job or you could like not have a job. So you may not have a choice in this matter, but here are some opportunities for us to re-leverage the skill set that we feel like you're really strong at into a new entity of the business. I'd be curious to learn from you all. What have you found to be effective for getting that buy-in for when change needs to happen, even though it's hard to take on? Anyone can go first.
I can speak to what has worked here. We moved from a very small business to mid-size in the span of 4 years. And so a lot of things have changed from small business to now how things work. We don't have high turnover. And so a lot of what you're saying is things that we've had to implement here at Good Ranchers. One of them is that emotional equity, really ensuring that you're transparent with your team members, your employees, your leaders, so that when you do need to have some tough conversations about maybe pivoting from a position that we've had before to now something that we have now, you've built that trust with your team members and with your leaders to be able to, they don't see it as like this abrupt change. We've been talking about it. We've been seeing where the company's moving. And so having that emotional and that equity with your team, they trust you. They trust the decisions you're making. They trust where the company is going. You not only are the one that is the keeper of the keys, but you have shared that as well with your team, that they trust where we're going as a company. They've seen the vision, they know where we're going. I think that transparency piece is so important because when you're transparent, you've been having these conversations, your team members know where you're going. And so it's not this, crazy conversation when it's like, hey, this is where we're going. These are the needs that we have. You can fit that need. So that's kind of how we do things here.
Yeah, I'm going to second the pivot, but I'm going to talk more about the communication piece. I think the communication piece, and this is where I think a lot of organizations fail when change happens. A lot of times it ends up, the communication starts halfway or 3/4 of the way through the process versus setting it up at the beginning. Even simple tee it up at the, hey, this year we've talked about having a goal for implementing this. So I want you to be aware of during the fourth quarter of this year, we're going to start talking about what's going to happen and how it's going to change. Just want you to be reminded of that. Middle of the year, hey, remember first of the year, we mentioned that in fourth quarter, we're going to be moving to this. So I need you to start thinking about what we're going to do to make that change and how we're going to move that forward. I think the transparency is part of it, but I think the over communication is almost a bigger part of it because it's not a surprise, because no matter how many times you tell somebody something, if I tell them once and go to something else, they're going to forget about it. So you have to tell them and communicate. I almost go with the path of over communicate, because at that point, people understand what's coming and they're ready for it. And so they're ready to move into the change as you move with it.
So I would also, agree with what just Erica and Rob said. Communication, over communication, transparency are the key. But I can tell you from my side of the story, because we work in the services segment, which is very dynamic, and IT services technology changes literally every day. There are new products, there are new services, there are new skills. By the time you catch up on, let's say, Java 2.0, 3.0 is out, right? So it's a very dynamic industry. So communication, transparency are the key. But I also would like to add that the employees should marry into the values and the mission of the organization, which basically means that you know what you're walking in when you join an organization. It's not going to be a succession path, which is going to be laid out for you for like 5, 10, 15 years. It can change in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and we will work with you. So how we work as an organization is always training. I think the second biggest department we have in our organization is training, for a reason that we have to keep upskilling our engineers. We have to keep telling them this is the new, this is the latest, this is the greatest, and then tell them that, hey, you are in this project, but there is another project which is coming in, which is more exciting. Yes, it might mean that you have to pick up A, B, C additional skills, but we'll help you get there. and then we prep them, and then we show them that progression path. And for the industry like ours, it's more more number of things that you know is better for you. So it's always going to be the values and mission that the organization has, and then supporting the individual with picking up those new skills once the communication has been made to them that this is changing, helping them just feel supported.
Here, can I just add one more thing too? I will say, like, with the over communication and transparency piece, there's a double-edged sword with that, because then when people start, like, it doesn't happen and they're excited about this like vision and we're about to go into this whole, and then it changes. That is where I think sometimes employees or your team members can start to feel like, what is happening here? Like, I thought we were going this way. I got excited. Now we're going this way. Now we're pivoting this way. There's like a caution there as well, with like a little bit too much or not knowing where you're going as a leadership team, where you're kind of being a little flip-floppy at some point, and not doing that.
See, and I think there's two parts to that. I'll add two things. One is with what Shubhra said. Part of it is you have to be authentic as a leader, and I think authenticity is one of the biggest things we have to do as a leader. The other thing is, and this is one of my huge pet peeves right now with a lot of companies that I've been involved in and watched over the years, is find a strategic plan and implement that strategic plan. And I get it, market change. But if you're authentic and you communicate why we're changing, hey, we thought this was going to happen. Market has changed. Here's why the market has changed. So we're going to have to pivot to this. Because one of the biggest problems that I've seen trying to lead your team is the constant pivots. And I've been in organizations that one of the ways they like to mix things up is they change leadership within different team leaders. They would switch managers. One organization they would switch managers literally every year. Like, no, you're going to go lead this team. You're going to go lead this team. And I was like, that's horrible. And they're like, well, what do you mean? We're broadening their experience. I said, yeah, the problem is though the manager never owns anything, because they come in, they implement their stuff. 1 year later, oh, it's all going great. And they go do something else. And then 6 months later, you find the pitfalls, as you mentioned, of that constant change. And so now that manager, oh, well, he did great over there. Yeah, for 1 year, but what happened afterwards? So part of it is, as a team leader and also as a leader, is being able to really think strategically. And I like to joke, a manager is responsible for the next couple of days. If you have the structure where you have a supervisor, they're responsible for day to day. Your directors, they're responsible for a couple of weeks out. Your VPs are a couple of months out. Your senior leaders, that's like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And if you can't think strategically, depending on the role you're in, that's really where you have to expand as a leader, because that lets you build your team up, because then you're communicating the strategic vision as it builds its way down as you move forward.
Right. I feel like you can be as authentic as you want to be, but it's such a fine line, because not everything you want to be transparent about, some stuff. And that's where it comes with, hey, what is it that we're sharing? What is it? And it's not about being secretive. It's not about being, but to what you said, it's about being strategic with what it is that we are sharing.
Yep,
and what
exactly.
Because we know that we don't want to exhaust our team members.
Mm-hmm.
That's so great. Eric, I'm really glad that you brought up that point of because at the end of I'm glad that you brought up the challenge of being super overly transparent, because when you do that, you potentially create mental residue and fatigue from your team members, because they're just getting whiplashed around with the new changes going on that are being contemplated. And so it's really hard. Where do you find that fine balance? I mean, ultimately, if we're asking ourselves, like, gosh, why doesn't every company practice transparency? You look at this, is that ultimately you have to have a lot of conviction to make a real substantial business change in the way the business operates. And if data is starting to show you that there's evidence to the contrary, that this may not be the actual path to go, you'd probably be better off having not shared anything with your team because you haven't determined this was the path you wanted to move in the first place. But then when you decide I want to go, you've got to give them the grace to actually like take it in, digest it. And to Robert's point about repetition, I think that's really, really powerful of just, repeating over and over and over again. I think that's something that a lot of managers and leaders miss, and also assuming certain communications have occurred. So for example, I've seen some companies practice open book management where they'll share the finances with everybody. But the executive team's miscalculation was the assumption that everybody would know what the ramifications would mean if the business was going down. And so, in the example I'm sharing, I know a company, they had been practicing open book management. They had 3 down quarters in a row. The employees were, they ended up having to do a layoff, and that sucks, and it wasn't great. And the employees were shocked by it. The employees were like, I can't believe this is happening. And they're like, hey, we're practicing open book management. You can see we've had 3 down quarters in a row. But the employees are like, well, that could just mean we're not getting our bonuses this year. I didn't realize I was getting laid off. Like the ramifications for this, like information, they didn't contextually know. And so I think what's really critical is that when we are communicating with people about what the change is, we also communicate what the ramifications are and the why. I think that's also really critical. How do you go about communicating the why when it comes to the change that you're enacting or the change initiatives that you're pursuing within your teams?
So I think it's if I can go first here. So I think it's also about taking it slow, right? What Erica and Rob said is yes, you have to communicate, but you have to plan well ahead. It's like you don't tell everything to every member of your family until you have made a decision. It's kind of similar to that, right? Like especially if you're the senior most person in the house and you have children, you're not going to just let them into information, but as a leader, you probably have plans, right? You know that this is coming. Maybe your organization is going through some strategic leadership changes, is going through some kind of, third-party agency to evaluate things, those kind of things. You know that there's something coming. And then what you start doing is prepping up your team saying, hey, these are things that we need to look up. These are the reasons we should be looking into these things so that the transition is slow. And then when the actual event occurs, yes, as you rightly pointed, you have to give them time to digest, to actually also have an open book conversation, which is like have the doors open for them to let them in and say, hey, you know what? You guys did not do this right. Okay, fine. You just listen. I think part of good communication is, as I guess Simon Sinek always says, is you just not have to be a good speaker. That's actually later. You have to be a good listener. So be ready to just listen when the change comes in and keep those doors open as you actually execute the change, and expect some level of disappointments and accept that there would be some challenges through the way, and then deal with them, take a deep breath, deal with them step by step.
Well, and that's part of it. And part of it is, I think the other piece is also ensuring that as you're going through change, you're communicating how it ties back to your mission and values as a company. How does it fit in with what we're trying to do? How does it fit with our values? How does it help us if we have corporate, what we call them corporate objectives? A lot of companies call them corporate goals for the year. How does those corporate goals work with your team? How do those corporate goals work within your organization? And how does your team goals move forward into the organizational goals as you move forward? And having it all tie together is the other part about it, as you build those metrics out. And then in my mind, one of the more important parts is you decide how does your metrics actually, or what metrics that those affect does your team affect? And so how do you put that in? Because as you define all of that and work all of that together, then you can kind of move the change forward. But it's making sure of that. In training, we always call that the WIFM, what's in it for me. And so it's always trying to define what's in it for me, but also the WIFO, what's in it for the organization. And if you can tie the what's in it for the organization to the what's in it for me, that's what gives you the buy-in. Because one of the things you find out, much like we all have an emotional intelligence, there's a new theory, new book. I read it, went to a session by the author of change intelligence, and that we all have a change intelligence quotient that we move within. And I think that change intelligence, to manage that, and figure what that out is for our individuals and our teams is even more important.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit onto that, you know, I come from education. I was a building principal for years. You're having to make these shifts of curriculum, things that the district's bringing. So you learn how to bring change in and to get that buy-in. And I think one of the biggest pieces is being able to listen, because they're gonna come with questions. And sometimes all the time, addressing those is like the key to getting that buy-in. Because if you can paint it beautifully and you can say, we're making this change and this is what we're doing and this is how it benefits and this is all the things. But if they leave the table and they have all these questions of, how does this help in my department? What does that mean for my day-to-day? I see this thing as being a huge issue with what I'm doing. If you don't address those, they're leaving, and they may have said like, yes, great, we're going to do it. But they're going back to their department with every single question, with all of the what ifs, and you really haven't got their buy-in, because it's not until you address those issues that you truly get like, okay, I see it now. I see it. You've answered my questions. And so now I get where we're going.
And there are two things that happen there, if you don't mind, real quick.
Okay.
Number one, not only they go back to their departments, but then they start talking among themselves.
Yes.
And number two, most leaders are afraid to say the answer at the end. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to impact your day to day. We haven't got that far into the project yet. However, and this is one of my tricks that I like to do. However, would you like to be part of the team that we can bring in, and let's start exploring that as a part of it? And I think that's another way to get buy-in, is you find those critics and try to find them out. I always like to find the most curmudgeonly person in the world, and they're the first person I always go talk to about the project.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a really interesting strategy. I like this, but I think this is really all Shubhra and Robert, you brought this up before about this concept of aligning the mission and vision and the values of the organization before anything else. How do you go about achieving that in the hiring process? Because like that's a major drop your ego at the door type of thing. Because when you think about it, most often we say, oh, we're hiring for a project manager, or we're hiring for a frontline supervisor, or we're hiring for this or that or whatever. And you say all the job descriptions, all the job requirements. And so in their mind, they're thinking, oh, you know what? I am here to fulfill XYZ position. That's me. And it sounds like Robert, based on what you've described, is like, no. You sure, you might be currently filling this position, but most notably, you are helping us achieve this mission, this vision, and practice these values, regardless of what your title says that you are. And how do you go about getting that sort of like ego drop at the door in the interview process? Because I feel like it's so tempting just to hire for skills and hire for, you know, who's got the degrees or who's got the certifications or whatever, but not actually look at the, hey, are you in this to help us achieve this vision, mission, our core values, whether you're mopping the floors or you're actually doing the things that we're hiring you for? Like, how do you go about getting that buy-in on that in the interview process?
So I can go first, right? I have when you state the vision and mission of an organization, that's one piece of it. So somebody walks into our organization's door and say, hey, I'm interested in this job opportunity. While you laid out that this is the job description, you also say, I mean, in most of the job descriptions I have seen, it'll always in the end talk about the company. Who's the company? How long have they been there? What do they believe in, right? It's something which is very intentionally done by most talent acquisition leaders so that people know what they're walking into, right? But when you are in front of the table, your job as a leader is to explain the job expectation along with the company's mission, and also identify their unique strengths, right? So I may be hiring 15 project managers at a given time, and all 15 would be for different set of projects. Today is my requirement for X projects. I'm trying to match this person, but I also want to look for somebody more agile who knows, let's say if the X person has to leave or has to go, the Y person is able to cover up for that job, right? So agility is something which is extremely important. So identifying the unique strengths of the individual, trying to understand what is their preference in the job, right? When you're interviewing, oh, so okay, so you have done these kind of projects. What else do you feel comfortable with? Have you managed multiple teams? Have you been just in single projects, depending on their experience, right? How big of teams have you managed? Okay, so there are questions, there are leading indicators which are actually going to take you towards the person's strengths and what is unique about them. What you do is you identify those things. For example, in my team, I have somebody who's very comfortable with making phone calls. And there's exactly the opposite person who just is comfortable with their writing, and they're really good with that, right? So as a leader, you have to identify those things. You have to encourage them as you bring them in from the beginning. You have to have a program. It can be, it can be training, it can be support, it can be development, it can be mentoring opportunities. So let's say if something is missing, you understand that this person has done project management, but has not led multiple projects. You probably set up a goal for them saying, hey, I think I really believe in you and I think you can do multiple projects. Why don't you work with ABC as your mentor alongside what you're being mapped to, so that I'm preparing you for the next position or the role, and you'll be able to take probably more, learn something more. The person feels valued because there is a mentor and gets exposure to more and is more aligned to the overall organizational objective, right? So those are the couple of things that I think, and eventually, you can give them, you can empower them through autonomy, trust, creative problem solving kind of things, which follows through the process of being a leader and encouraging your team members. But from a talent acquisition standpoint, I would say unique strengths, identifying them, and developing a plan for their personal development.
So I want to ask a quick follow-up on this, because, I think the concept of like aligning the mission, the vision, developing people and their skill sets, that's, all critical. I think that makes tons of sense from a high-level C-suite executive perspective. But when we're talking about large organizations or even medium-sized organizations, it's multiple people down the organizational hierarchy who are actually doing the interviewing and bringing people in. And they're oftentimes not trained on how to look for these characteristics, look for these outcomes. More often than not, their metrics are, did I put a warm body in a seat? What was my time to fill rate? Like, these are the ratios that these talent acquisition professionals are being measured against. They're not being measured against oftentimes, in a year from now, is this person still at the organization? And are they doing a really good job? Are they getting high marks from their respective manager? Unfortunately, those metrics seem, at least my experience, seem to not be incorporated in the talent acquisition interview process. So I'd be curious to know, how can companies go about better training their people who are actually interviewing people? And, have you ever seen any organizations adjust their incentive policies to incentivize those types of outcomes that we're looking for? High marks from their manager 1 year later, still being at the company 1 year later, achieving a promotional path of some sort within 2 years. I don't know. But I don't know. I'd be curious to learn your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And how we have done it, at least in my current organization, or have seen it in the past, yes, the talent acquisition team needs to be trained. And usually every talent acquisition process is not going to be like 1 or 2 steps, but multiple steps, including the talent acquisition person, their manager, eventually the hiring manager, a couple of people within the organization, and then it goes finally to HR for the final round of interviews. So there are multiple, I would say, meshes which are deployed to ensure that people are a good match. And yes, there is a training incentive. So for example, in many cases, people have to stay with the company for a certain amount of time for the talent acquisition person to actually be 100%, I wouldn't say paid, but incentivized. Like, you have additional incentive, the person stays. That's an important piece.
What is that duration, out of curiosity?
I'm sorry?
What's that duration?
Usually, I mean, again, I can talk for multiple locations would have different things. So for example, I know that in India, it's up to a year. For, let's say, European country, it can be a quarter, right? At the end of the day, how quickly can you get the absorption in based on what your resources are and make the person feel a part of the organization is what is that determining factor, is how I have seen it. But from a leadership standpoint, you're right that those things have to be continuously cultivated in the culture. Another thing is once you have these kind of goals and objectives, the overall I should say onboarding process and making people comfortable getting, like, we have touch points. Initially when anybody joins is weekly. After that, it's fortnightly, quarterly, and making sure that they are set up for success. And the immediate mentorship and alignment also helps with the whole idea of understanding what the organization is. But yeah, you're right that it starts from talent acquisition, which needs to be trained, but also there should be meshes that should be applied at multiple levels to make sure that the person aligns with the overall organizational objectives. And then eventually it's about how do you culturally fit that person and mend those changes. And when you say fit that person, it's not a one-way street, right? So for example, I'm used to working in a certain way. Tomorrow I join a different organization. It's not that only I have to change. It's also that if I bring in ideas to the table, is the team open to applying those ideas? So giving them that room also is a big source of building the culture of an organization, if that helps.
Robert, are you going to share something?
No, Shubhra actually covered what I was thinking about saying. So on that, other than the one thing I was going to comment on was I think it's super important as part of this is you have to define when somebody is an effective employee. One of the companies I worked at and was running training at, we were a call center. So it's super easy at call centers because you can define. So we defined, it took someone 6 months to become what we considered an effective employee. It took 18 months for us to determine that we had our return on investment from their hire point, which meant for us, they had to be there 2 years for us to get something out of them, because 18 months was just getting there. We actually made money the next 6 months. And then, so we actually, there was movement when I was leaving the company to actually start tying incentivization to our talent acquisition team to that 2-year period of time. Because at one point we were running a 3-month turnover, and that was a horrible moment. Because I think I was the only one that knew the actual numbers, and somebody came to me and asked for them, and I was like, 3 months, and he's like, "Are you sure? Here, let me show you the spreadsheet." But it was that. But part of it is it's kind of like a lot of things is we have to define what the metric is, and I think that becomes more difficult depending on what our role is and what our definition is. And part of it is we have to understand how we define success and how we defined the specific metrics we're trying to measure. And that's really where the challenge comes in, I think, is that.
Robert, Shubhra, and Erica, I've got a question for you all, but Shubhra, you brought up this concept earlier before of, regularly upskilling your team and regularly giving your team training. That was like the second largest department within your organization. Robert, you also brought up this concept of longevity and leadership. Oftentimes you've seen other companies where they'll switch people out after a year, and the idea is that they'll have a very short-term mindset when it comes to enacting new change, because ultimately they don't actually have to see that change through. It's, you get a new head chef in the kitchen every year. Well, everybody wants to run their process or their system their own way, and it deters progress from ever happening because no one's actually seeing it through. But at the same time, I could also see that there's an element of someone potentially getting lazy, resting on their laurels, not wanting to make change because they just don't want to rock the boat. That I see happening a lot in organizations where someone's been in the same position for the last 5-10 years. They don't see the need to change. Everything seems to be good. They're, cruising on life. Everything's going all right. How do you go about striking that fine balance between proactive training, keeping people engaged, and just keeping people motivated to keep making positive changes for their organizational departments, without you forcing it upon them?
So I'll start that one. Part of it is one of the core values we have as a company is continuous improvement. And so much so that it is like, and most companies have continuous improvement as one of their values. It's always, okay, you did this. Could you do that? What would it take for you to do that? And then finding, what do you need to make that happen? And if you need something, let's provide training on it. What training can we provide? How can we do it? Let's look at the training. Let's look at the training you're giving your team. Let's look at the training you're getting. How do we get you ready to move to the next level? Well, I don't want to move to the next level. Okay, that's great. If you're really good where you are, sometimes moving up's not the right answer. Sometimes it's best to leave you where you are. But if your team is performing at an X level, how do we get them to X plus one? And some of that as a leader is, how do you challenge your team with that every time? Part of it is revisiting your strategic goals. My training group meets once a year. We defined a 5-year vision last year. We just met last month and we reviewed all 5 of the goals. Where are we on this? We actually added a goal because we found something. Hey, we're not talking about this. Let's add this to it. Every month when we meet, we check in where we are on the goals and how do we meet and drive the continuous improvement from there. Go ahead.
My only challenge or call out or just kind of curiosity on that answer is, you mentioned that, if someone comes to you and says, hey, I need this training or I need this upskilling, then you look at it and you determine that. But I would care to argue a lot of people think that they're doing just fine and they don't need to change. And so they won't proactively seek out the training or guidance or insight because they're like, hey, I think everything's good. Like everything's, working, steady Eddie. This is great. I'm fine. And the leadership team's like, no, it's not. Like, we need you to choose a training or we will choose a training for you. Like, how do you keep that proactive continue? Let's put it this way. How do we go about avoiding continuous education and continuous growth from being corporate jargon? Because most companies say that. Most companies use it as corporate jargon. It goes on a wall somewhere. They got a nice paint job. They take a picture of it, put it on social media. They go, rah, rah, continuous improvement and education. We believe in that. But how do you actually practice that?
For us, we challenge everything we do. It's a challenge. We did this. Okay, how do we do this plus one? The other part of it is anytime somebody says they're complacent, my answer is always, I look at somebody and says, and Sears was once the largest retailer in the United States and should have been Amazon. And if no one, look up the history of Sears. Sears had the catalog program that should have been Amazon, and they sat on their laurels. Everything was great. We're number one, rah, rah, rah. And I'm going to challenge, I don't know of a Sears store left in the city of Houston at this point. So part of it is remind them that, it's the old adage, failure to grow leads to total failure. And if you don't challenge that, some of it is having that understanding. And some of it, back to Shubhra's point at the beginning, is really the discussion at the beginning of when you hire somebody. Do you hire them for that skill set? And doing the best you can to avoid those. And if you have someone who totally sits on their laurels, maybe it is time to move them. Make sure you move them to a team where, I hate to say this, they can sit on their laurels and not try to continually grow. And it's not going to super affect the organization at some point. That's kind of the answer at that point.
Erica, we jump in there. Shubhra.
Adding to what Rob just said, right? If you are a very big organization, as I said, that I worked for multinational organizations also, it's as the number of people grow, it becomes hard to monitor sometimes, right? The way I have seen companies addressing this is you have 2 years in a role, right? Starting towards the end of the second year, you start to think about what do you want to do next. That's personal, but also as an organization, the usual policy is you don't be in a role over 3 years. And that's a stated fact, right? So you don't be in a role more than 3 years. So you start looking for it yourself. You work with your manager, finding towards what's next, because even for the manager, there's you reach your peak after, I think it's a proven theory that you reach your peak after a certain period. And once you have, it's time for you to move on. And you move on when you're at your peak rather than moving on when you're declining, right? So one of the things which we have seen, particularly worked at least in my previous experience, is keep changing. Don't do that. It's not just about a promotion. So today I'm a manager, I'm a senior manager, I'm a director, but if I'm doing the same job and I'm not feeling excitement in that, it's both ways, right? From a personal standpoint, I need to start looking out after those 2 years to see what additional job I should be doing. And the second is, and I should also work with my manager, and my manager should also have that as a part of the KPI. And the second is the organization should automatically have a blanket term saying that, hey, anybody can be in a job role for a certain time, and it can be something similar that you might be doing, but there has to be some kind of change. From a technology standpoint, how I've seen this working is there are applications, and I've done this in the past, which would be regular feedback. And we do that in our organization, right? So it's like you have continuous feedback weekly, monthly. So let's say if I do something great in like something astonishing this week, and there is an app which basically I can just, my manager can just recognize me throughout the organization. Everybody knows, oh, Shubhra did something fantastic, right? Similarly, so A, it's more beneficial for me. B, all of this is recorded as a part of my quarterly, half-yearly, annual review program. And we don't have to wait for that final day to say, oh, it's been a year. This is why we are giving you this review. This is why we are giving you this rating. And that continuous conversation and that responsibility being resting on the manager, anybody who's in the borderline of succession, should actually be actively contributing to these things through these applications. These applications just make this easier, but the conversation has to be continuous. It should be weekly, monthly, turning into quarterly, and then annual. So that's one of the ways from a technology standpoint.
Erica, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I mean, I think you guys, hit all the points. I think really like hearing everything, like it boils down to like a company's culture around continuous learning and professional learning. Because if it's not a part of like your DNA, it becomes almost like a compliance piece. It's like, oh, we got to do this thing. But when you hire leaders and you hire team members who are all aligned to the same vision, then you get a team, you get a company who is continuously learning, continuously growing, and it's a desire for them to want to do that, and not just like this, like check the box. We met, we talked about KPIs, we talked about blah, blah, blah. We talked about all these things, but we're all in this wanting to grow and continue to, move forward in our careers.
I love it. Well, Erica, Shubhra, Robert, this has been a great pre-symposium panel. I feel like we covered a lot of ground in this pre-panel today. If you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet these three great leaders, or I'd love to join this next executive symposium, you should. It's on October 17th next week in Houston, Texas. Topic is how to maximize our team's potential. I'll post a link in the comments of this video on how to RSVP. I hope to see you all there.